Hello, everyone. It's our distinct pleasure to welcome Amanda Carrico for our today's speaker series presentation. She will talk about her most recent research. I want to welcome everyone online, of course. Thanks for being here, and everybody here in the room. The big distinct advantage for people in the room is there's food. For everybody online, remember that for next time, it's worth the visit. Anyways, I'm so pleased to have Amanda here giving her presentation today. She is an associate professor in the environmental studies program here at CU Boulder. She came to CU Boulder in 2014. She is a trained environmental psychologist, and her research examines behavioral responses to environmental stress, and this particularly on migration, livelihood adaptations, and household level actions to mitigate environmental risk. Her recent work, or not just her recent work, over the years, her work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, by the Office of Naval Research, and the City of Boulder. During the several years, Amanda has led the Bangladesh Environment and Migration Survey over several years to collect socio-demographic data about migration, climate change adaptation, and economic conditions in Bangladesh. And besides her research, she is an associate deputy editor with the Climate Change Journal. She is an elected member of the APA Board of Scientific Affairs, and she directs the CU Center for Sustainable Landscape and Communities. Very impressive. Since 2014, as I said, she's here with us at CU Boulder after she completed a postdoctoral fellowship with the institute, the Vanderbilt Institute for Energy and Environment. Besides a very impressive, highly impressive publication record and the funding record, I want to emphasize how much I adore her research as an example of interdisciplinary research, really collaborative teamwork across the social and natural sciences. We are looking forward to hearing from your research. Amanda, welcome.
All right. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I am really looking forward to reintegrating with IBS in the coming weeks, years, and months. I was like sort of making a step towards doing that and becoming a bit more involved. My research over the last several years, I think, is becoming more and more aligned with the work that's happening in IBS. And then the pandemic happened and we all withdrew, and now it feels like a great time to sort of reintroduce myself and hope to find ways that we might collaborate. So it's good to be here. I appreciate the invitation. I do like to start with I wonder, if I do close this little guy, will it? I think it's okay. Okay, if there's any impacts on the transcription, hopefully someone will let me know. The more here. All right. Hide this guy with that. Aha, even better. Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to take a second to introduce myself. So thanks, Stefan, for the great, kind introduction. I am an environmental studies faculty member. My background is in psychology. I've meandered a lot, like I think a lot of folks in this building do, in terms of the methods and topics that I'm interested in working on. And I have the real privilege of working with a really awesome collection of graduate students. We call ourselves the Environment and Behavior Lab. We have a pretty open door, porous policy. So for folks that might be interested in some of the behavioral dimensions of environmental change and adaptation, come check us out. But I just want to call your attention to some of the cool work that our group is doing. I'll be talking today about how we think about adaptations to climate change and the way that migration is used as a strategy to adapt to climate impacts. But I also have another thread of work that's interested in, especially in the US context, the environmental values we hold, how that shapes our engagement with environmental problems, and the adoption of pro-environmental behavior. And so Victoria and Elizabeth are doing some really cool work in that area as well. All right, so for today, I'm gonna talk about two topics. Most of the presentation, I'll focus on this first topic here, which is a conversation about how social networks are interacting with environmental change to shape the migration decisions that people pursue. And that work obviously is situated in Bangladesh. And then second, I'll share back some findings from a seed project. I was privileged to receive a seed grant in 2021 to sort of launch a new project and try to scope out some future directions for this work. So I'll share back a little bit of those findings and talk about the next directions we're headed in. So with that, let's kind of start by thinking a little bit about the context here. So we're talking about climate change and migration. Obviously, this is a topic that's demanding a lot of attention today. It's frequently in the news and the media. It's one of, I'd say, probably the most common ways that members of the general public are encountering or thinking about, at least in the US, the impacts of climate change. It's a very kind of visible manifestation of how climate change might be shaping people around the world. And there's good reason why it, I think, attracted this attention. It's a very consequential phenomenon, right? Migration affects how people are distributed around the planet. It affects the kinds of economic opportunities people have access to. It affects family dynamics, demographic processes. It can lead to, or in some cases mitigate, social conflict. So it's important. It's a really important, I think, topic to study, and there's a lot of reason why folks from across different academic and practice settings are interested in this topic. So the question I want to begin to kind of tackle a little bit is whether climate change might be changing the very processes that are leading to migration in different parts of the world. So we know that climate change is likely leading some individuals to move when they otherwise may not have. So it's likely affecting the number of migrants that are leaving their origins. But might it also affect who migrates? The conditions that might allow some people to move and others to stay behind. Might it affect the choices of destinations people pursue? We already know that when people move during periods of environmental stress, they tend to prefer or move to shorter distance destinations, more domestic trips. So it might be affecting where people go. We know a lot less about the kind of outcomes that they experience in their destinations, the employment pursuits that they look for, their health, the way that they integrate or not into the destination society, and how they're received by the receiving communities. There's a really, I think, important and interesting project that my colleagues at Michigan are pursuing now, which is finding that in the United States context, people tend to have more bias and prejudice against refugees when they're described as climate refugees. So there's something kind of unique about people who move under these conditions that in some settings might be triggering certain forms of discrimination. And then also, how might it affect, and it is a different how it affects sending communities and the households. So, you know, I'll just go ahead and throw out, it might be that climate isn't that different, that what we're seeing is the same set of processes and mechanisms and dynamics that we've seen and studied for many, many years. And they might be amplified a bit because there's this kind of push factor that's driving people to consider migration. But it might be that the processes are very different, as I just said. And so this framework by Kazan and Orgel-Meyer, I think, is a really helpful one, in which they try to delineate between moves that are more discretionary in nature. People might take high risks and go to long distance destinations, seek out unique economic opportunities or education. Those tend to be more planned out, and perhaps those moves have different kinds of selective processes that affect who does and doesn't go. When we think about weather conditions and climate shocks pushing people to move, we're talking about a different form of migration here that they define as risk-reducing migration. It's very possible and plausible that these kinds of trips are planned less in advance, that they tend to be a bit more spontaneous. We know people plan them out, right? But they may not be planned out with as much lead time and with as much consideration of the different kind of characteristics, factors, and choices that a person might make on discretionary trips. And it's likely that these have different kinds of selective pressures, whether your income, your social networks, land, livelihoods, the kind of complex dynamic set of factors that are at play here relate to who chooses to go and who stays behind. And this is the question I want to kind of begin to look at today is how those dynamics might be different for environmentally induced movements. So I'm going to look specifically at this social network piece of it today. I mentioned in the abstract and the title a bit about livelihoods. I'm going to push that aside a little bit until the end of the talk and focus more on the network piece because that's kind of where my energy's been with the analysis we've been working on. So what do we know about social networks and how it relates to migration? So when I say social networks here, I mean ties, social ties to other people who have migrated, okay, ties to the migrants themselves. This has been a very well-studied topic within the migration literature. We know that social ties to other migrants are important in facilitating new migrant trips. There's lots of potential reasons for that. There's likely some shared economic resource base that people and their networks draw from, but also importantly, the information and the assistance you gain from knowing other migrants is really pivotal in helping to facilitate a trip. It essentially reduces the barriers to leaving. You can learn how to get there, where to go. Social connections in the destination are important in increasing opportunities of successful trip, so people are able to use that assistance upon arrival. So all of this is really important for helping people to migrate successfully. And the theory of cumulative causation is a sort of way of thinking about the social dynamics of migration as a form of social diffusion. Just like other things diffuse through society, we see takeoff periods and then a sort of slowing down of the rates of new migration as those social networks diffuse and all the people who want to leave have left, right? And then you kind of see a sort of tempering of that process. But the idea here is that as migrant networks grow, migration tends to be a bit less selective, that more people are able to migrate because it's not as hard. And so you don't need to have as many resources or unique skills to be able to execute a trip as those networks sort of grow. All right, so that's the kind of basic theory that was largely developed without at least directly considering climate conditions. We've always thought about the environment, but a little bit less in detail than we're thinking about it now. And if you draw on this background theory and think, well, what would you expect for how networks might operate when people are facing these environmental stressors that might come due to climate change? One predominant theory, and I'm citing Lori's work, and I don't know if Fernando's on the line, but this is a paper coming of our group here at IBS, not mine, this team. We might expect that social networks would, what we call, amplify the relationship between climate change and new migrant trips. People, if you look in the blue line there, people with access to migrant networks, when they face some kind of environmental stressor event, might be therefore more likely to migrate because they have all that information and social resources to draw on. Those without social ties may choose to migrate, but be less likely to be successful in executing that trip. So that's the first hypothesis we'll test with our data, the amplification hypothesis. But keep in mind, this sort of prediction is really grounded in an understanding of migration that's not thinking of as much about it as a form of adaptation. It's really thinking about it as a more discretionary set of movements where people are planning these things out over longer periods of time. If we think about migration as adaptation, we might want to think about it within the portfolio of strategies that people might utilize to cope with environmental stress, right? We know that migration is commonly used. We've known that for a long time, but it's often not the first, second, or even third preference a family might pursue. It's pretty tends to be lower down the priority list of how people are going to cope with these changes. Thinking about it within that perspective, it may well be that when you have ties to other migrants, you can draw on their income or their resources in a different location. It might actually stabilize your livelihood during times of stress and therefore reduce the need to actually move. Now here we're really kind of bringing in a story of remittances, which I unfortunately don't have in these data just to kind of forecast that. However, there's potentially more than just kind of ongoing remittances that come in that could relate to a family's resilience if they have social ties to other migrants. So this theory is one of suppression, that those with ties are less likely to move during environmentally stressed conditions because they don't need that form of adaptation nearly as much, and those without those ties might need to turn to migration more frequently because they don't have the resources that migration brings them yet. We always talk about these competing interesting interaction effects. It's good to remember that there may be no interaction at all, that we could just have a steady state kind of main effect. We know that those with ties tend to migrate more. That might be true even if we forecast out into periods with more climate stress. This is still important, right? Because it still shows you that networks are really critical, and that is potentially a critical way by which people are accessing forms of adaptation. So I think we should just remember that that's important as well. So with that background, here are the 3 research questions I'm going to be looking at with our data. Do social ties to migrants moderate that relationship between extreme weather and migration? Do these relationships vary across domestic and international trips? I didn't get into that much, but we have reason to think that it might. And does the type of social ties, do the types of social ties matter? Close personal family ties versus extended networks versus community-based networks. So the data I'm using come from the Bangladesh Environment and Migration Survey, the BEMS. So it's been a pleasure to be involved in this project for a while. We're now, I guess, in maybe our 10th year of this research. We've got a really fantastic team, some of whom are in the room. We've been working in the southwestern region of the country. You can see the cutout here. So far, we've been to 30 communities around the country. And we're using an approach that was developed in the Mexican Migration Project. So we do some pretty in-depth structured interviews, but those that are designed to be somewhat flexible to allow the interviewer to elicit out information about livelihoods, economic conditions, and movements. We privilege, let me skip past this real quick, retrospective approaches. We use kind of tables structured sort of like this to record information about movements a person has made over the course of their lifetime. Same with livelihood, same with land that they hold, things like that. So we do a lot of work to try to bring out important critical information about a person's past. That means we can't get a lot of detail. We can't recreate the remittances they received 15 years ago, but I think we're pretty good at figuring out about which year a migrant trip may have occurred. They're pretty memorable things. And when I talk about migration here, I'm meaning a decision to move to another, in this case, Upazila, would be kind of like a county type movement in the US context, and to set up a new residence in that location for at least 3 months. So we're not talking about visiting family. Some seasonal migration will be eliminated because of that. We're talking about people who are really moving and starting a household in a destination. So I am using data from the second round of our BEMS data collection. These data were collected in 2019. We have 4,000 households from 20 sites included in our data set. And I'll show you some of the models in just a second, but remember, we've collected these kind of retrospective stories of people's movements, and what we're doing is trying to consider mobility over time and to overlay that with information about the environmental conditions that people face. So you're just seeing a basic frequency distribution of the number of migrant trips made by males over time, and we brought in this information about heat waves and drought conditions to try to understand how those movements are corresponding to the environmental conditions at a particular place at a particular time. So here's our sample. I'm just looking at men here. I'll say a little bit more about women's migration in a second, but because the processes are pretty different in terms of mobility across males and females, we have found it useful to separate them out and consider them in different models. And so I'll be looking at male household members, 15 to 54, and the likelihood that they're going to make their first migrant trip, which tends to be the most significant trip that they're going to make, and the most connected to other kinds of variables, such as social networks. So I'll just flash up the kind of trajectories of migration over time in our locations. It's good to remember there's a lot of other stuff other than climate change happening in these places, right? Climate change is a fairly small signal in a location that's rapidly developing, that's undergoing a lot of demographic, social, and economic change. We know that migration is part of that story. We see a remarkably accelerating trend of domestic migration. International is still much rarer, but you can see is certainly increasing over time. The models I'll show you are hazard models. So I will be using logistic regression approaches to predict the likelihood that a male makes a first migrant trip in a given year or not. And I've got a bunch of controls in there that I can talk about if you're interested. I'm separately predicting a first domestic and an international trip. And the key variables, of course, are these social ties variables and then the extreme weather variables. So social ties are measured in 4 different ways. I'm looking at whether the household itself has sent a migrant in the past, so they have a very close relationship with migrants. Close family ties, that would be like an aunt or an uncle, grandparent, not in the household, but someone that's a close familial relationship. Extended family would be cousins and maybe more distant aunts and uncles. And community prevalence refers to the proportion of males within the community that the household is in that have migration experience up to a given year. So all of these vary over time, and they're capturing different facets of how social ties might operate. And so what we can see is a somewhat expected story based on the literature that having social ties does seem to relate to the likelihood of migrating. The closer the ties, at least for domestic, seems to be more important. For international, the ties are even more important in general, although there's a little bit less, well, I guess it is a bit more kind of close ties that seems to matter more. And then we've also brought in 3 types of extreme weather. I mentioned heat waves and drought already, and we've also included whether a cyclone or a flood affected this community. And all of these are telling us whether the community was affected within the year or the year prior. So we've got like a 2-year kind of rolling average approach here. And again, we see some expected effects. We've seen this in the literature before. We've seen these in our data before. Heat waves tend to be the most important factor associated with mobility in this context. There's an increase in movement in the year of or after a heat wave, and cyclones or floods. Those are hard to distinguish because in some cases it's high winds and cyclone impacts. In other cases, it manifests as flooding. There's often the same event are also associated with increased movement. This is the heat wave effect just over time, just to give you a sense of that relationship, domestic and international. So let's look at the interactions, which is really what we're interested in today. So what do we find? We find a small relationship between social ties and domestic mobility that seems to suggest more of this suppression process. So if you remember from the 2 kind of competing hypotheses I showed you, if social ties suppresses the relationship between climate and migration, we ought to see we ought to see people with social ties migrating less during affected years. So some muting of the relationship here. And that's what you can basically see here. So those without social ties, you can see there's an increase in the likelihood of them migrating during affected years versus unaffected years. But those with social ties, it remains pretty stable. There's really no kind of change in the propensities across those conditions. You see a very similar effect with drought, a bit more subtle, but also, again, a very slight increase in migration among those without social ties, and actually a noticeable drop among those who do have social ties. They're less likely to move in those years. Whoops, let me go back to this. Next, let's look at the international relationship, or the relationship for international moves. So here, the only form of social ties that really seems to matter is the prevalence within the community of other international migrants. This is, I think, I'd love to hear from others who have done this work, reflective of what the literature has suggested as well about the kinds of ties that really matter. And here we see a pretty strong effect associated with heat waves. Now remember, heat waves are our most important environmental stressor that is linked to mobility. And here you can see it's those with the lowest, who live in places with the lowest international migration prevalence that seem to be migrating internationally much more frequently when you've got a much more intense set of heat waves. It's not that common to see international mobility in response to environmental stress, so I was fairly surprised to see these moves happening. But you can see that kind of, very different trajectory. And all of these other social ties groups, you can see have very little differentiation across them. There's very little migration happening, especially as heat waves intensify. That's just a zoomed in portion of those other 3 lines there. We see a very similar pattern with disaster impacts. So again, within unaffected years, there's very little trend among those who live in places with little to high community prevalence of migration. But when floods and cyclones happen, those with the lowest access to those community social ties are the most likely to be leaving on international trips in that year or the year after. So if we were to draw some conclusions, I think we can see that social ties might slightly suppress climate stress and domestic migrant trips. It's important to remember the social tie role here is a bit weaker and the climate effect is a bit stronger for domestic moves. So I think it's a pretty subtle relationship, but it is some evidence of possible suppression effects. But the stronger, I think, story here is that international migrant networks seem to correlate with less mobility after heat waves and after cyclones, which I think, Lori, replicates what you all found in the Mexican context as well. Yeah, so interesting to see kind of some replication there across settings. All right, so I've got about 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. So let me talk a little bit about some other kind of work that's happening in future directions. And then we can have a discussion if you're interested in questions. I do want to say we just talked about men here. And I think it's important to remember there are women also in the world and women also move. And so I just want to give a little bit of a plug for Helen Wilson-Burns's research, who she's looking at women's mobility and really digging into the interesting patterns and how and what factors are associated with women moving, including movement that's separated into trips that are more family oriented and those that are more related to independent economic earnings. And you can see a real interesting increase in economically motivated trips among women. And as this increase happens, you also see women's mobility being increasingly connected to environmental conditions. So there's a story to tell there. I think it's a story that's been missing a bit in the literature, but Helen's pursuing some really interesting papers that are focused on this. And then, yeah. Mm-hmm. Husband and wife, I think Helen would be familial trip here, right? Oh, thank you for the reminder. The question was whether economic trips are exclusively solo trips versus trips with family members, and the answer is yes, they would be solo trips. Doesn't mean they travel completely alone, but it wasn't to accompany family. Yeah, male family members. Sorry. Yeah, thanks. And then also Samina, who just arrived to see you, gosh, 3-4 weeks ago from Bangladesh, is looking at the experiences of women who stay behind in origins when their husbands leave, and to understand the social and psychological conditions that they experience. She's looking especially at mental health of women who stay behind and how climate might relate to that as well. So a couple other dimensions of this. So let me talk a little bit about our seed grant findings, pivot a little bit, same place, same basic project, but a different emphasis. I was really privileged to receive a seed grant in 2021. And it was exactly, I think, what we want seed grants to do, which really like catalyzed a kind of new project and some focused attention on that work, and has also led to some new funding, which is fantastic. So thank you, CUPC, IBS, for all that. The two questions we're looking at, we're really focusing our attention more on how migration is affecting conditions in the origin. How is it related to adaptation in situ in communities where people are often leaving from? So the two main questions we're focusing on is, what are the effects of migration on agricultural resilience in these sending communities? There's a lot of interest in Bangladesh of food security, food production. There's a high rate of land conversion and a lot of rural to urban migration. And so there's a basic question about whether Bangladesh can remain food secure in the coming decades as the sort of economy and use of land is changing dramatically. So we're interested in understanding how migration might be interacting with those dynamics. And also I'll just flag, I didn't talk much about the livelihood dimension to our data, but we see very clearly that those who are more likely to move during environmentally stressed conditions are people who have land-based livelihoods, especially agriculture. So you're just seeing the kind of interaction there where the agriculturalists in green are the ones who are responding more through mobility to heat wave effects. And then the second research question we're focused on is understanding the impacts of COVID on migration and land use and well-being. So all of our research projects now have a COVID component to them because we can't avoid it, I know. But I think this is a very interesting moment to understand how migration interacts with resilience. We've not really seen this scale of return migration in at least our lifetime. We've seen a lot of repatriation associated with conflict and war, but this, I think, is declared, I don't know if it's still holding up, as the largest peacetime repatriation of people in the world in known history, in this recent history. So what does that mean for the families that rely on remittances? What does that mean for the communities who send migrants and whose economies are very tightly intertwined with earnings that come from these destination locations? So we're trying to understand some of that as well. So we are going to use this funding to collect longitudinal follow-ups with about half of the households that we visited prior. We already collected some pilot data collection earlier this year in February and March. We went to 2 communities and interviewed 60 households. We were really trying to develop our approach, our protocols, make sure we felt like we could return to the right households, connect persons over time, and other kinds of things that I'll talk about. And then now that we've done that, I'll be heading to Bangladesh in a couple of weeks to work on the next phase of scaling this up with an SF funding. So we'll be collecting data on the remaining 18 sites over the coming months, hopefully wrapping up in February. So we have, I guess, two major objectives. One is we're really interested in land in this phase. So we want to understand the agricultural context. So we're going to update, data about land holdings and land use, agricultural conditions, fill in some gaps there. And then also walk out to the fields with the farmer and collect the boundaries of their agricultural plots so that we can then collect parcel information, connect that with the survey data. So we did this a few months ago. This was the biggest question mark, how receptive will farmers be and how accurate will the landholding information be? This is Sanol in the kind of pink shirt there, one of our research assistants, who's walking around a parcel with the farmer, collecting the tracks as he goes. And then we're able to create polygons out of that information and then identify those parcels on the landscape. And we're partnering with Chris Small, who's at Columbia University, who's a land system scientist. And we're gonna then use remote sensing data, Sentinel and MODIS data to extract information about land use and land use change over time. So these are things like double cropping, triple cropping, conversion from paddy to aquaculture, diversification of cropping, different indicators that might tell us a little bit about how agriculture is changing, even significant land conversion, which we'll likely see a lot of. So this is a little bit of a different analysis here, but you can see some of the resolution we can get in parts of the region where we're working. And then the third objective is to go back and to update our migration and livelihood history so that we have a more complete record and we can understand what was happening to migrants during this major disruption associated with the pandemic. So return or new migrant trips, livelihood adaptations that were pursued, and different kinds of coping strategies. So this is our pilot data collection, figuring things out as we go. And I'll share just a few nuggets of information. You know, we've got a very small sample size right now. We only have been to 60 households, but there was some very interesting, I think, patterns that already were emerging from these conversations. We found in this small sample size in 2 communities that there were 38 migrants among them that were away at the time that the pandemic emerged in Bangladesh. And about a third, a little less than a third of them had returned home within about 3 to 6 months after the pandemic had started. So a significant amount of return migration. 6 or half of those who returned have remained in the origin since then. So they have chosen or were unable to leave the origin again to pursue another migrant trip. A lot of, I'll just say anecdotally, more qualitatively, many of these were students who were unable to resume their education in, for example, Dhaka or another nearby city. We also saw quite a bit of new migrants migrant trips pursued. 13% of households had sent a new migrant, and they cited the economic disruptions of the pandemic as the reason for that migrant trip. Now, there's likely more happening there that we haven't picked up on, but the explicit connection between those trips and COVID, I think, is kind of interesting in what we're looking at here. And then finally, let me share a little bit of some of the ways that households coped with the economic disruptions of the pandemic. And I think it's interesting here to think about how migration falls within the broader portfolio of things that people do. So by far, the most common strategies were reducing consumption, mostly through food, but also through other kinds of expenditures, taking out a loan. The debt issue here, I think, is significant and important, not something we're looking at, but should be considered, how debt might affect people's well-being moving forward. A quarter sold some very important livelihood-based assets, land, livestock, equipment. Livestock was the most common here, but also land and equipment were shed as well. We see a number like 3, 4 or so, a household member migrating for work. But also the use of remittances as a way to kind of fill in those gaps. So having a migrant away who was able to remain in destinations, especially international migrants who could remain in those destinations, was quite important. And then as we move down, we see some activities that might affect the well-being of children and their access to education. So moving children out of school, pursuing the marriage of a family member, this is usually a daughter, pursuing a marriage for a daughter, or sending children to work, usually related to the taking them out of school part. And then finally, reducing expenditures through housing and other kinds of selling assets. So this is just a little snapshot to kind of let you know where we're going. I'm going to stop here, but I hope to have some questions, and any input, feedback would be lovely at this point. So let me thank our collaborators and funders, and thank you for being here. Okay.
Thank you so much, Amanda. We have some time for questions in the room, online. Laurie, please.
Oh, sorry, my back. I said, thank you, Amanda. It's fabulous to hear what you've been up to. My first question is about, you didn't have amount of remittances in the earlier data, but didn't you have a dummy of just whether or not a household had received remittances? And so I'm wondering if you interacted that with the social network. That would be super interesting. And then do you have anything on return migration in the previous data that's not related to COVID?
Great, thank you. So interacting remittances with information about social networks. We do have that information. As we go back in time, it's a little more difficult to integrate it into the longer time series analyses, but we could absolutely look at it within more recent periods of time, possibly like kind of just sort of having a subset analysis. We haven't done it yet. It is on the list. I think it's part of where this paper is going, and I agree. I think it's an important part of the story that's not currently missing, and would, I think, kind of shed some light. I have a feeling that's largely explaining some of the drops in migration associated with extreme weather events, but that's just a theory. It's not really tested yet. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then your second question, return migration. Yes, we also have that information. Yes, we do have it in the data, and I think that's rich and available and can be, exploited quite well. It's just not something we've kind of processed the data to be able to incorporate it yet. But yeah, I think it's a great question and something we'll look at.
Thank you. Thanks for a super interesting talk and great research. I also have 2 questions. That's okay. The first one. So it looked like you correlated, or you sort of graphed mobility and extreme weather events. I'm curious if you asked people why they moved, and if in doing so you ever heard or you looked at whether or not weather or extreme climate events ever actually came up as a reason. And then The other question is whether, and maybe I missed this on the slide, but the return migrants from COVID, whether that was domestic or international, or if there was a different pattern. The ones, I'm curious about the ones that are staying in particular.
Okay, thanks. We did ask people why they moved for the trips that involved the household head or the spouse, because that's who we actually talked to. So this is not a complete record of why you moved, but this is at least a partial record. And this is the pattern we tend to see. So 60% of the time it's economic, to work and earn money. If you were to, I think this is males and females, if you were to limit this to males, you'd see that economic bar, obviously expand way out, just given the kind of customs of marriage and familial relations. Environmental is almost never mentioned, right? And when it is mentioned, it tends to be very, very extreme situations like I lost land to erosion, which is a very common hazard in that area, and that leads to a lot of displacement. But it's a very unique, not unique, but a specific kind of form of environmental stress. So for that reason, we really do need to, I think, look back at the record and look at correspondence. I mean, absolutely the reason was economic, right? There's no question, right? But the factors that precipitated the need to look for more economic opportunity in other places, I think is what we're interested in. So when you think about what caused this, it's a kind of a complicated question. What causes me to do something? It's multifaceted, and it's got a lot of different kind of layers and temporal steps to it. Yeah. And I'm sorry, this is what's the second question again? Oh, COVID, yes, right. I haven't actually sorted that out yet, the international versus domestic. This is one of the reasons we do pilots, because in the record of reasons why the return trip happened, a lot of folks said their visa was retracted, but you can see the timing is very much associated with the onset of the pandemic. So I felt like we missed a lot of information there. We know if they were international or not, but the kind of conditions that led to the return are a little murky, and the kind of things we're sorting out in the next phase, So we can look at timing, and I think there were several international migrants that returned, but that's a pretty small sample of the overall set of 38 migrants I see there. Maybe 6 or 7 of them were international. So it'd be a little bit hard to determine any kind of patterns. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Amanda. So it seems like now towards the end of the talk, you're kind of talking more about the economics of migration and not so much about the climate events that may have precipitated the migration. So it seems to me that perhaps maybe it's a lack of data issue, why you don't model it as kind of an economic decision, but more of a climate related decision to migrate. I guess the question, could you comment on that? I could see something like a causal mediation that flows through livelihood losses or something like that.
Thanks for the question, Krister. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the framing of the way we discuss our findings is a story of climate, although I think it's sort of implied, and our understanding is climate is shaping economic opportunity and vulnerability. And so it is an economic story on one level, but with an emphasis on the kind of the forcing that climate introduces to that process, I guess. So why not more? I think the question is, why not explicitly model economic conditions more, right? And I think one very short answer to the question is, at least at the household level, it's a lot more difficult to recreate economic conditions over time. We can date a move, and then we can recreate histories of environmental conditions, but to know what the household's assets were in 1985 would be not very likely to be able to recreate. We do know information though about their education levels, which is highly correlated with economic conditions. We know about their livelihood activities. And so in a lot of the models, we are introducing things like skilled labor, unskilled labor, agriculture. It gives us a little bit of a picture about the economic vulnerability or opportunities a family is sort of experiencing. And that is a very powerful factor in this story. So I didn't focus on that much today, but it is I was actually planning to, and then I just decided to go in a different direction. But I think that is a very powerful part of the story. And you really can't understand climate unless you interact or understand and bring it into context with the livelihood and economic conditions. So I think your point is right on. Yeah, I hope that answers sort of your question. Yeah, I think Waverly may have had it.
Thanks so much. I actually have a question kind of relating to some of the earlier work you were mentioning on the biases and potentially migrants that are perceived as being climate change, having completed climate change induced migrations, potentially facing more biases. And I'd seen some research that was looking at that from like, presenting, say, an article to a focus group and then seeing how perceptions of the climate change induced migrants varied. And I was just wondering, especially in relation to that last slide that you were showing, is there any sort of like data from your research or others that's been collected on actually if those sort of biases are being experienced by migrants that either you're looking at, if they're kind of self-presenting their reasons as migration due to like these other factors? And has there been any research like kind of on that side of things?
Thanks, Waverly. Very good question. The answer in our project is basically no. We have not really looked much at that. I would love to know, I know there's a few folks from Bangladesh here. I think, from my perspective, it's quite difficult to kind of access that dynamic for me culturally and with the language barriers. I'd love to know from folks who are in the room if they observe any of that in your experience and the way people talk. I have not really witnessed that. It's not come up much in conversation, but at the same time, we haven't really probed that. But I think it's a very interesting question and an important one that should be looked at more. Unfortunately, yeah, I can't really speak to that. Yeah. I welcome any reactions. Yeah.
I think that it's a kind of a follow-up, and I was going to hold back, but the two questions are sort of making me ask it again. I think this is a super interesting and really important conversation, and the last question was really interesting, and I think a possibility. And I'm going to put forth the other one, which is an article that I read a few years ago by a very provocative title. I just sent a copy of it to you and Lori to see what your views are on it. And it's called "Climate of Anxiety in the Sahel: Emigration and Xenophobic Times." And basically not talking about necessarily the negative image of, that these particular migrants, but that basically calling people climate change refugees lets people in Europe, because this was the Sahel to Europe more than movement to the US, but to let sort of people in the West say, okay, we're going to address climate change. And it lets this sort of, particularly, it kind of lets everything else off the hook, and it doesn't deal with colonial structures, development structures that continue to like suppress local communities in terms of access to particular resources and economics. And so they are basically saying that it's just kind of this label that is that works in the North, but not in the South. But I think, sort of a challenge to their work is that they didn't do what you did, which is this sort of comparison of what was actually happening, and that people might, self-filter what they say are their reasons. But I just think it's a sort of a fascinating conversation to have, and about, what we call climate change related and what the impacts of doing that are.
I think I can maybe respond to one of the comments earlier. So I'm not a climate scientist. I'm training to be an information scientist. And I have done similar research in the context of the US. So I was trying to understand how people's perception or belief system around climate change can be predicted by their belief system around other things, like if a person is vaccine hesitant, how much likely they are to believe in climate change, things like that. But for Bangladesh's particular perspective, I think the crisis is so normalized that they believe in it, but they don't feel the necessity to act against that, or don't have the capacity to act against that. that kind of brings me to a question that I was thinking of asking you, is that you're talking about southwest part of Bangladesh. And as far as I know from my lived experience in the country, most of them basically go into nearby larger cities, or most possibly in the capital, where the effect of climate change is more visible in many cases because of the high temperature and things like that. And how those return migrants that you observed, did they talk about at all their experience in the big cities where those changes are more visible or not?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. Yeah, this is, I've had many very interesting discussions with return migrants about life in these destinations and life in their usually villages. And I've also had the opportunity to meet and talk with migrants living in informal settlements within Dhaka who have not yet returned. So there's sort of the kind of two contexts in which we've had those discussions. And I'd say almost all the time, there is a very strong sense of wanting to be home, and a kind of, there's this, it's so fascinating, you know, and I think this kind of like tension between the economic opportunity that happens in cities and the vibrancy of cities and the opportunity to be in the mix of things and to earn money, but what you give up because of that. And I really feel that tension come through so profoundly. So I think you can see people actively negotiating that, right? So that's one comment I'll have. In the urban spaces where people are actively living in formal settlements, Corral Slum was the one that I was at. People, I think 99% of the migrants there wanted to go back, and they were working to try to secure access to land. And as soon as they did, they were going to go back. Now, my sense is that doesn't actually happen that often, that return trip back and the ability to get land, because land is so difficult. But there was a very strong desire and commitment to try to figure out a way to get back into the rural settings and to assemble a lifestyle that'd be more sustainable in the long term once you did so. So that was my sort of sense of those two things. Yeah. Yeah, but interesting question. But the ones who were in the villages were also kind of plotting the next move. So there's this very different kind of orientation among those in destinations, at least in Dhaka, and those who are in villages. Yeah, thanks. Okay. Oh, Jane, please, let's see. Do I need to?
I need to unmute. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
This is wonderful, Amanda. And I think your group and the work that Randall Kuhn's group now at UCLA is doing on migration and on the impact of those who stay behind is quite similar, and we should get everyone together who's working on that. I'm particularly interested in the impacts on women. And you didn't divide in your presentation, your first presentation, whether there were differences in the factors for men and women. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Jane. Could folks hear, or shall I repeat the question? You could hear, okay. Okay, the question is, Jane Minkin is asking, whether there were differences between the males and females migrants in terms of the conditions that lead to migration. And the models I showed you actually excluded women. I'm kind of embarrassed, but you know, there's statistical reasons for that, but you only saw conditions leading to men's migration. However, and Helen, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I wonder if you have any kind of reflections on the different kinds of correlates that look across the two models. So I'm going to hand the mic to Helen Wilson-Burns, who's a PhD student whose master's thesis is focused on the correlates of women's migration.
Okay. Hello. Okay, so I'm thinking about like the context of what you presented. Social capital is incredibly important for women. So if you see family members or friends who have gone to especially garment producing districts, they're much more likely to migrate if there's other like examples of females who've done this. I also see, so Amanda showed a interaction where agriculture, land-based livelihoods increase the effect, right, of migration after climate. I find the opposite for women, though I will say I define agriculture in a slightly different way. So instead of livelihoods, I'm looking at land holding. So it's more of this landlessness effect than if you're in that industry perhaps or working in that. So there seems like the mechanisms are fairly different, but there are consistencies in terms of people being important, livelihoods being important, and then environmental effects being pretty differentiated by both of those things. So the environmental effects are very different for certain groups of people than other groups of people. I could talk a lot more about this, but I will not.
Nice.
Pretty good for being on the spot. If there are no further questions, we are on the top of the hour, so it's probably a good time to finish up for today. A big thank you to Amanda again. It's great to have you and hear about your most recent research and what you're planning. All the best for the coming months during your data collections. And thanks everyone for being here in the room in person, eating the food. I hope it was good food. And everyone online, thank you so much for being with us, and see you next week.